Crash, tumble, steady, balanced, buyer's market? What is going on with the real estate market? That's what we're going to talk about today, and we're starting right now.
I'm Sherri Green with Coldwell Banker. Welcome to my YouTube channel that guides home sellers and home buyers in Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia.
Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. With this video, I'm going to launch a series called Market Update or Market Snapshot. The point of it is to really tell you what's happening in the market. Everybody's always curious about the real estate market and what's going on. And I want this series to bring to life what's really happening in the DC area. If you're watching some of the news, you see some headlines that could make you wonder what's happening. You know, some of them have said that there's a housing recession. Some have said that housing prices are plummeting. Some have said there are dark days ahead for real estate and the housing market. Is that really true? One of the things that I think is important to think about as we go through this series is real estate is local. You've heard that phrase before, and nowhere is it true more than in the market like we are in right now. So nationally, there are some of these headlines, and some markets are experiencing a little bit of doom and gloom, but is that what we're seeing in DC? And that's really what I want to talk about, because some of these headlines can be scary. And while this is what we're hearing on the national news, it may not be true where you are, and it certainly may not be true where I am. And that's what we're going to talk about today is DC and the surrounding market and just what's happening. What are we seeing in our market? You know, DC is a very transient market. People are constantly moving in and out, and sometimes we just aren't affected in the ways that the national news says everybody in the housing market is being affected. So let's dig in and dive a little deeper and see if we can find out just what's happening in our DC market. So what I want to talk about first is sort of a big overview. And I want to look at what's called the Housing Demand Index. And that's going to give us an indication of a lot of different things that are happening. It's going to show us what is the demand for housing in our area, which sort of speaks to sentiment, and it also speaks to what is happening in the market. Are people buying or are they not? What's the inventory like? What are the prices like? And how is that affecting the entire market? So let's jump over and look at the Housing Market Index and see what it's telling us. So this is our Home Demand Index. And what this first piece of it shows you is really an overview of the market in total, right? This is the whole sort of DC area. And what you can see here is that demand did fall in July. It was down just over 8% over June. And it's down over 10%, almost 11% over last year. So sure, that speaks to a slowdown. And frankly, we kind of needed one. The frenzy that we've been going through really needed to stop. We're seeing a lot of buyer fatigue and a lot of escalating prices. And, you know, was that really realistic to continue? And what this is showing us in this overall demand is that demand is still moderate, but it has slowed down some. It's kind of like we're back to normal, and that's a good way to be. A balanced market is really the best market for everybody, the buyer side and the seller side. Certainly a lot of sellers saw an increase, but not everybody could jump into the market right then and see that increase. And then if you're a buyer who's selling, where were you going, right? That was the question we sort of have talked about in a lot of different videos. So this moderate level of demand doesn't say crash to me. But why don't we dig into a few more specific areas and see what they're telling us? So let's look a little bit more at a year-over-year comparison. And that's what this chart's showing us. And you can see the orange line and the blue line, and you can really see how it dips and falls, right? And you can certainly see that there is a change year over year. The gap was certainly smaller in February, and then it peaked in April. That's really when our spring market took off. And this year we saw that peak decrease. It was the highest peak of change that we saw in April. And it's inching back closer in July. So overall, since April, the index has decreased by 14%. And why is that? Yes, it's just what you think. It's a rise in prices and a rise in the interest rate that can affect some buyers' ability to purchase or what they can purchase. So let's zoom out, because that's a cool chart to look at, and it's fun to see the roller coaster ride we've sort of been on. But let's really jump into what the total area around us, and then we're going to get a little more narrow. But I want to start here with sort of this DC and the metro serving counties, right? So when we look at this, this is showing us the DC metro area, but then it's also including some further out counties. And when they look at this DC metro area that we're talking about here, what they're really talking about are counties that include, let me show you. So this DC metro area includes all of these general counties, right? Here's DC, moving out to Montgomery, down into PG County, down into Fairfax, and similar areas like that. When we go back out, this is Central Virginia. This really takes us further out into Culpeper, Fauquier, Page, sort of the really western and southern parts. Going back in, you've got West Virginia and Maryland here, and then Southern Maryland over here. And this is what I think is really interesting. That moderate level of demand is right there in the DC and the surrounding counties. Montgomery, Fairfax, PG County, you name it, right there, we are seeing the moderate housing demand. Same in North Central Virginia. What's interesting is Maryland and West Virginia seeing high demand, and so is Southern Maryland. Now, what does that say? You know, I think there's something to do here with vacation properties, buying a second property, buying an investment property somewhere that's out in the country or down on the water, down on the river. I think those are things that are really attractive to people, that if they are going to live in the city, they need a little bit of an escape. Or it still could be some people migrating around. If they still can work from home, maybe they just want to work a little further away from the city. So that shows you what's going on here. But here's the headline. We again, I'm going to pull it back down. We really aren't seeing a crash or a plummet here. We are seeing moderate demand or high demand depending on where you're going. So now I want to jump down and let's look at inventory by type. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. That whole map before was red. But now when we start to look at this starts to get a little more interesting. And you can see the red is this month's index, right? The blue is the prior month's index. And you can see that we are down this month across the board, in some categories more than others, but we are down over June, okay? Now let's dig in and really look at this, because I think this chart is kind of hard to, it doesn't really tell you as much as it should. When we get into certain sectors, this is where we really start to see some interesting findings. So when we're looking at the single family home that is selling below 400,000, this is where demand has become low. And why is that? This is a direct result in high interest rates and high prices. When buyers were shopping last October, November, December, and January, and they were seeing an interest rate hovering in that 3%. And now we've moved into 5 and we're starting to inch down to a high 4 for some people, and especially with an ARM. But moving from 3 to 5% is a game changer for a lot of these buyers. It's a game changer for a lot of buyers, but I think you get what I'm saying. It's a harder monthly payment for them to make when their monthly payment changes dramatically with a 2% interest rate change. And then we've got rising housing prices. And that just throws an entire monkey wrench into the whole process, right? So this is where we're seeing limited demand because these buyers just aren't engaging. And what's interesting is just this week, DC announced a huge change to the HPAP program. Now, the HPAP program in DC is the Home Purchase Assistance Program. Okay, so Home Purchase Assistance Program. An HPAP is a program that issues funds in the form of low interest loans that allow households to defer the repayment for up to 5 years. And they can use these funds to purchase a house and use it as closing cost. It's a really cool program. Here's the big news. Starting in October, first-time homebuyers may qualify for up to $202,000 in assistance from the city. Now, it is all based on income. So if you're buying $1 million house, you probably don't want to call me and ask about this program. But it's really great news, and I think it starts to speak to affordability. There's one thing that I've always said. Everybody deserves a home that they love. And this program starts to even out and help some of those buyers who've seen that interest rate rise, and now they can't afford to do what they wanted to do last October, November when they couldn't find a house because the inventory was so terribly low. Here they are, and now HPAP may be able to step in and help them. So there are some eligibility requirements and some things like that. And again, it is a loan, it has to be repaid, but the rate is much better. So it's worth an ask if this is something that you could qualify for. But back to our demand. The interesting thing is HPAP certainly could change that, right? This sector, this under $400,000 sector, certainly could see a change in the coming months. And it's something I want us to keep an eye on as we go through past October to see if people start taking advantage of that and does our demand change. So that's going to be fun to watch and interesting to watch as we go through. Let's move back and move into the single family, move back to our home demand index and look at the single family index for homes that are around 400 to just around 950. And when I say that, I mean 1,000, but 400,000, 395,000 to 950,000. And here we are back at our moderate level again, right? So it certainly was down from the previous month, but it remains moderate. And even though the monthly supply rose, we still see the lowest of any segment here. And so demand remains, pretty high in that moderate level. Again, we're not at a slow pace here. It is just a moderate pace. And these buyers were somewhat affected by what we've seen with the rising interest rates, but clearly not as much as others. One of the things looking at this, I wonder is what explains this moderate level? If inventory was lower, would we be creating more demand from this sector? It's hard to know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. The truth is it's great that inventory is moving back up because that's really what buyers need to see is choice and less competition to make them feel comfortable in the market, because that's why a lot of them jumped out. Now let's look at single family homes above 950,000. Here we are back at the high demand. This is a really interesting situation. The supply rose, and that's great that interest is up, and so is the demand. These buyers probably were not as affected or are not as affected by the interest rate rise. They're probably comfortable using an ARM if they need to. They watch the market enough that they know they can refi in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So this buyer category is a real sweet spot, right? And this buyer is still looking for their house, so demand is high. Let's roll down and look at condos. So condos below 570,000. And this is a really interesting piece of the research to me as well. We're back to moderate in this category. Supply had risen, which is super helpful for the market. But I've certainly seen condos selling a little slower than the frenzy that we saw in all of sort of 2021, right? It's encouraging to see that demand is moderate, and it's encouraging to see what our supply looks like. But if you look at the home demand index from the prior year, you can certainly see that it has lowered itself back to this moderate category, whereas it was sitting at a very high category. So that's really interesting. I think it's telling. But what I also think is nice to know too is that it hasn't stopped. And I think a lot of people were afraid that condos were going to see another super slowdown like they saw in 2020, right when the pandemic sort of was getting into its groove, let's call it. Beginning of the pandemic, what we saw was no one did anything for a couple of weeks. And then April, May, June, July, everything really took off and everything really sold. Then we got to about July and condos just stopped selling, or they were selling much slower. And then when we got into 2021, that all changed. People got comfortable with where they were. We had vaccines and people felt like they could come back into the city. As the market has slowed down, I think a lot of people were worried about condos and are we going to see that again? And I don't think that's what we're going to see. I think we're getting back to the right moderate level of interest in condos. And this chart just sort of speaks to that as well. Let's get into condos above 750. And here we are again. We're back at high demand. And this is really fascinating, and I think it speaks to what we talked about in the homes above 950. This buyer just isn't affected by what's happening. This is a buyer who can afford to spend a little bit more. They've got a little bit more savings, and they're back still with high demand. Now, the demand has decreased from last year. If you look at the home demand index from the prior year, it is down, but it is still in that high level. And that's really a great thing to see for the market. It just shows we are still in a very robust DC market. Let's roll over into row homes. And this is sort of all prices. We're back to that moderate level again. It's down from the high demand of last year, but again, it is steady and it is not slow. So I hope that was really interesting. What I want to now do is turn to looking at pricing and what the list prices have looked like for the last couple of months and what the sales prices have looked like for the last couple of months. And I think you're going to find this part of our research, of my research, really interesting. So let me do a little screen share over to our July snapshot of the market so that you can see what that looks like. So as we're going through and looking at July, this is condo, single family, and townhomes. And in DC, you hear me talk a lot about row homes, but that's what this research is pulling. That's its word for it. So it's sort of used synonymously, if you will. So what we're seeing here is the average sales price is down about 3% from the previous month, which makes a little bit of sense. The average list price, however, rose. So we're talking over the last 3 months, we saw a little bit of an increase here. And why is that? Well, I think it speaks to the fact that sellers were seeing this rise in prices and they were excited about that happening, right? So in many ways, we started to see buyers changed their mind about what they would pay for things, but sellers were still sort of hung up on where the prices had been and wanted to price their homes this way. And when we look at August, this is going to all make sense. So look again here. We've got the average list price is up, but the average sale price is down. Okay. The sales price to the list price ratio is sitting right at 100%. Hilarious that means it's down 1% because things were selling above list price, right? Still in June. The number of properties sold, 726. It's down 28% from June. Fascinating. And then the months of inventory available is just under 3 months, and that is up, right? So that shows to inventory sitting longer and we having more choice with that. When we were in some of the frenzied months, we were down to a month of inventory at best. So now let's jump over and let's look at August because it presents us with a different picture. So if we look at August of this year, and I know we're on the 24th of August, so this isn't the full month yet, but I think it gives you a little bit of a picture that starts to tell the story of this market. Our sales price still sitting at no change, but the list price has come down. And what does that mean? I think it speaks to sellers starting to get a little more realistic. Now, a 3% change in a list price certainly isn't a crash or a plummet, but it does say that sellers are getting the message that buyers aren't willing to go in this frenzied pace of price increases that they were. So now in August, sellers are starting to get a little bit more realistic about their pricing and realizing they can't keep raising prices. So prices are down, but the average sales price is sitting right there at the same number, which is just really, really fascinating. But we're going into the market more realistic and coming out still with property values remaining where they are. So that, again, doesn't speak to a crash and it doesn't speak to a plummet, as some have said in the news. The number of properties so far this month sold is down, but the month supply is rising. So we're getting back to that balanced market. And that's what this chart is showing us. So that's our market update for this week. Leave me a note in the comments and tell me what you think about all of this research. As I mentioned at the beginning, I really want to do this market update probably once every 3 weeks, maybe once a month, so that you can keep up with what's happening in the market. And I'd love to know if this information is valuable to you and what you thought about this video. So make sure you leave a comment before you leave. Don't forget to subscribe before you leave. And then if you want to know more about what's happening in the luxury market, make sure you watch this video next. I think you'll find it fascinating.